So we're happy today to welcome Dallas Eggers. Dallas was my counterpart. I worked in Hudson at the school district in the technology department. He was my counterpart in Prescott. So got to know each other through a lot of meetings, tech meetings and that. And in our retirement, both of us have found ourselves working in history, which that wasn't my background. That was it before. So it's been kind of fun. And he's here today to talk. I heard that he was recommended as a speaker to me. And thought it would be fun to have him talk a little bit about the riverboats and river travel on the St. Croix, and he's here today to do that. So, and just had a question or a comment before, if you can speak up, because don't think they have a microphone. So
Okay, not a problem. So a couple more things about me is that I ended up as a Western River certified Coast Guard pilot. Started as a deckhand, worked my way towards the first mate, and became a pilot in Christmas Eve, 1983. And at that point in time, Prescott had 41 licensed Coast Guard pilots in the school district, possibly the highest percentage of any city in the nation. And I didn't realize that. And as I traveled around in my job, I was told by all these people, they knew all these people from Prescott. I says, how come you know these Prescott people? Everybody knows the Prescott pilots. Jacques Cousteau, his pilot was from Prescott on the Calypso. The Delta Queen, pilot was from Prescott. So my grandmother was a cook on the towboats. My mother was too. I had an uncle killed in 1948 in a towboat accident. So it was in my blood. And being born and raised there, and I have been fortunate, young lady, through my entire life because I had great history teachers. I had great history teachers. The best ones are the historians. They're storytellers.
Am I going the right way here?
Well, that's fine. Come on in.
Thank you.
But the best history teachers are the storytellers. They're the ones you get in and they tell you stories, but they don't even talk about what you're reading. Because many history teachers say, well, read page 39 through 54 and do the questions on 55, and the kids are going, where I had Mrs. Schubert, who escaped from the Nazis. And so to have her as a history teacher was inspiring because I talked to somebody who had lived it. So find the storytellers, because in human history, the storytellers is what have really carried humans forward. All right, so today, we're going to do a little steamboats. Steamboats are one of the greatest inventions of humankind for expanding civilization and our reach on the planet. Because remember, when your forefathers came here, there were no roads, there were no bridges, you came by water, or you didn't get here. And so this guy, he's kind of, I own most of what he has written. His period on the river was very similar to mine. I read his stuff all the time, and he kind of influences me. He mentions in A Life on the Mississippi the mouth of the St. Croix, right out in front of us, and the city of Prescott. And he also made a statement. He said he thought that the upper Mississippi River was the most beautiful river on the planet, and he was well-traveled. Now, I've been to Europe and a few other places in Central America. He might be right. Of course, I'm biased. So this is Mark Twain. There's another one. George Byron Merrick is a Prescott kid. He moved there in the early 1850s. His father owned the warehouses on the riverfront. And at that time, if you owned a warehouse, you were wealthy. And so his bedroom was on the third floor overlooking the riverfront, and he watched the steamboats come in every day, every night. He went on the river in about 1856, 1857, became a pilot in 1859, left the river in 1862, and joined the Union Army. But he is also in the Steamboat Hall of Fame. He probably wrote what I call, to me, the best book on the upper Mississippi River. It's called Old Times on the Upper Mississippi River. And the reason I think it's better is he goes into what were the boats really like? How did they operate? What made them work? What's a low-pressure steam? What's high-pressure steam? Were there really gamblers on the boat? What was the food like? Why did they sink? Did they burn? Who died? I mean, his books are fabulous. I have 3 copies, and they're all tattered and written up, and one good one I borrowed at people. So George Byron is probably, and Merrick State Park in Wisconsin is named after him. Well, this is Philander Prescott. That's us. He was quite a character. This is Prescott in 1840. The only building right there is Philander's house. He was holding the site of Prescott for some military men who had claimed it. At this time, he had one home. There were at least 50 to 80 Native American dwellings at Prescott at that time. But he had to hold it because the military men claimed 1,200 acres. Originally, Zebulon Pike did. So then we talk about how did they get up and down the rivers? Well, of course, they had canoes, they had pirogues and these types of things, but we hear about the flatboat era. That basically is the flatboat. They build it out of lumber. It probably leaks a little bit, but it's made out of wood, so it'll float. They went downriver. Very few of them ever came back upriver. And some of them were 100 feet long and could carry as much as 100 tons, which is a lot. That's just like a semi-load and a half. And so we had this guy named Lincoln. As a youngster, he made 2 flatboat trips down the Mississippi, which was probably a good thing. And actually, Abraham Lincoln's first goal in life was to be a river pilot. I think he chose a better occupation. And when you talk about the lumber rafts and this type of thing, and the keel boats and the flatboats, we are told, because of what we see on television and movies, we see these gingerbread steamboats, and they're beautiful and they're huge. Most of them weren't like that. There was a lot of little workboats. In a general year, there were 300 to 400 of the big boats, probably another 200 little boats, and 4,000 flatboats went south every year. They would get to New Orleans, and they would cover the riverbank for as much as a mile or more. They would sell their wares. The ocean-going ships would come in. They would buy the produce. They would buy whatever they had for sale. It could be honey, it could be berries, it could be furs, it could be all these types of things. Then they tore the rafts apart, sold the lumber. And anybody heard of a place called the Natchez Trace? The Natchez Trace is the trail that the flatboatmen walked home on. They walked. Now, a guy named Walking Johnson made 31 flatboat trips in his career. And the horses, he would leave New Orleans at the same time as the horses. He would beat the horses to the Ohio River at Louisville. So they called him Walkin' Johnson. And then the keel boats would be torn. Some of them were kind of junky, so the people in New Orleans pushed them into the river and they floated out of the mouth of the Mississippi. Well, the Gulf currents travel clockwise. The Florida shore was littered with flatboats. And so the people in Florida would scavenge a flatboat to build their homes. So there's a lot more to it than just a steamboat. Keelboat. Now this kind of looks a little bit like a Viking ship. It's a little more aerodynamic, and they could use them back and forth. But guys, we had to get it upriver with a pole, maybe a sail. And you see this thing here, we'll get into this in a little more, that's a rope. What we did all day is we walked on the shore and pulled the boat upriver with a rope. Wow. Some of the trips upriver took St. Louis to St. Anthony Falls or Fort Snelling, took 3.5 months. That's what we did for 3.5 months. We dragged this 120-foot boat upriver. But they made it. They made it. And we're going to look at cordelling means we pull it with a rope. Well, this is the 1870s on the Missouri River. It's an actual photo. And there's what we did, guys. These guys are fending it off so it doesn't bump onto the shallow water. And this is what we did. We walked in the water all day. Now, as a kid, I did the same thing. I didn't know what it was called. We would paddle across the Mississippi, and you aim here and you end up across over here because of the current. And then we would get out, and one of us would get out and pull the boat up with a rope to get behind Prescott Island. So we were cordelling at the age of 10, 11, and 12, but we didn't know what it was. We just thought it was a lot easier than rowing. And the Missouri River is a whole different river from the Mississippi. The Missouri is no longer navigable above Sioux Falls. But Great Falls, Montana is the farthest inland port in the world that you could reach on water. 3,600 miles. Farthest inland in the world you could go on a waterway. But now, Steamboat New Orleans. Where do these steamboats come from? Well, you all heard about the Claremont and Robert Fulton and all this type of thing. He built that in 1807, went up the Hudson River. Everybody said he was crazy, but it worked. But the Claremont was an ocean-going steamboat. It needed 8 to 12 feet of water in this type of thing. It was shaped differently, and so a Claremont style didn't get there. So this guy with the last name of Roosevelt, they kind of hang around that Roosevelt family. So he was hired by Robert Fulton to move to Pittsburgh. He made a flatboat, and he traveled to New Orleans on a flatboat. Now, ladies, he brought his wife with him, and she delivered their first child on the way to New Orleans on the flatboat, out in the middle where there probably wasn't a town, city, or civilization, or even a house for 400 miles in any direction. So, interesting. Well, he came back the next year. He went back to Robert Fulton. He says, you know, I think we can do it. So Fulton sent him over the Appalachians again. He goes and he builds the first steamboat. That was the New Orleans. Built in 1811. It sank in 1814. But he made the first trip down the river. And what a trip it was. Now, his wife came back. She's pregnant again. And so they head downriver. And what they did was, everybody when they left town, they said, we'll never see you again. You can't go against the current. Because remember, nothing works. All new inventions, we are skeptical of them. So they headed out of Pittsburgh. They head downriver. And they go by Cincinnati, and they stopped at Cincinnati, and they said, yeah, we'll see you, we'll never see you again. Well, they got to Louisville, and Louisville is the falls of the Ohio. The boat could not go through there because the water wasn't deep enough. It had to wait for some big rains. So they tied up in Louisville, and all the people said, yeah, this won't work. So Mr. Roosevelt invited them for supper. When he got them all on the boat, he cast off, and they headed upriver to Cincinnati. And they did that for 6 weeks. He took people on rides from Louisville to Cincinnati waiting for the water to go to prove that they were wrong. And so he made it by the falls, and now he's heading down there. And the next thing he runs into is the largest earthquake in American history. The New Madrid earthquake, which lasted from December 1811 to March 1812, 3.5 months. It was felt over 65,000 square miles. To give you a scale, the great San Francisco earthquake was felt over 6,500. So it was 10 times the size of the San Francisco earthquake. The river ran backwards. Towns were wiped out. People were wiped out. And they're coming down the river in this boat. And ladies, remember, you're pregnant now. And you're out there, and they couldn't go to shore because they were afraid that the shore would either fall in or the trees would fall on them. So they had to anchor out in the middle of the river to stay safe at night. And they finally made it through that. Of course, then they get down into the Indian Wars, and they had Indians on both banks shooting arrows at them. So they had quite a trip in 1812. This is a New Madrid earthquake right here. And I've been around here, and this is like from here to here is 20-some miles around. For here, it's about a mile. So it takes you a long time. And here's what it looks like now. In the Mississippi, cut-off dams, this type of thing. There was a canal through here at one time, but it's gone now. But New Madrid, they say down there, but New Madrid is what it is called. So here's your first one. All right, this is what the first boat that really came to St. Louis looked like. It's basically a little tin can with a steamboat launched on the Ohio River, where most of the boats were built on the Ohio River. The majority of steamboats were built on the Ohio River. It came down the river, worked well going downriver. To go up to St. Louis, guess what, guys? It didn't have enough steam power in its low-power steam engine to get to St. Louis against the current, so we had to pole a stupid thing up there. They'd keep the engine on, but we still had to use poling to get it to St. Louis when the first one got there. The Zebulon Pike, named after Zebulon Pike, who actually claimed Prescott in 1805 when he was there. So it worked, but not so great. Well, now we're up here. This is the Palmyra, 1836, the first boat to come up to St. Croix. Kind of an unusual story. They got to the, aptly named, different than mine, they got to the Dalles of the St. Croix, just below Taylor's Falls where the big high rocks are. And as they were close to shore, the Native Americans were throwing rocks and stuff at them. So they rang the bell, blew their whistle, revved the engines, and the Native Americans took off in fright. Well, that's kind of how it goes. It's kind of how it goes. So let's see if I can get this to work right. So the steamboats at first, basic was military. We're going to carry supplies. We're going to carry soldiers. We're going to carry weapons. We're going to carry the payments to the Native American tribes. But you got to keep people afraid to control them. So this is the Western engineer. They built a steamboat that looked like a Viking ship in the front up here, and the steam came out of the nostrils of the dragon. Honest to God. And then the bottom was painted green, and it had the fins on the back, and it was precisely made to intimidate the Native Americans. Now, don't think our Native Americans were so different, because just shortly after that, the first steamboat on the Danube, everybody who saw it ran in fright. So it wasn't just the Native Americans, it was everybody who first saw it ran in fright. So this is, and here's a model of it now, what it looks like. But I mean, it's amazing what they do. Then later they started to haul immigrants upriver. They started to haul materials upriver. They would haul nails and screws and bolts. And as we got better, they would haul machinery. And the first war usage of a steamboat was the Black Hawk War down below La Crosse. When the Black Hawk's last battle, that was the first military use of a steamboat in the United States. One of my favorite boats, the Nominee, piloted by some of my favorite pilots, Daniel Harris and Smith Harris and these type of guys. It was a mail boat, and it went up the Chippewa River from Reed's Landing, which is in Minnesota, right across from the mouth of the Chippewa, went to West Eau Claire every day with the U.S. mail. Well, right now, you can hardly get a fishing boat up and down the Chippewa because it's all filled in with sand. And at the height of the logging era, there were multiple boats going up and down every single day. You know, how many of you are from Hudson? I'm assuming most of you. We're kind of biased. We think this is the big logging river. This is the Pipsqueak. This is the Pipsqueak. There were 9 billion board feet of lumber that came out of the St. Croix. 9 billion. Wow. The Chippewa, 25 billion. And in Wisconsin, about 7 billion. But they said that those three rivers built St. Louis, Chicago, and the Great Plains. And actually, the rail lines that came through here in 1879 hauled lumber too, while the lumber raft, the peanut line that used to run from here to Prescott, is now gone. It's another era of history. But the Nominee was a great boat. Here's the ticket, how you get on it. And the pilots were a business draw. There were lightning pilots. They were the fastest ones. There were pilots known that their boats were luxurious. There were pilots that they knew you could get on cheaply. And so here's another picture of the Nominee. Well, now we're getting to the Enterprise. The Enterprise was a boat that was around here. There were boats, and names are unusual. There were 4 or 5 boats named Enterprise. So it would sink, and somebody would take the name. War Eagle, there were 6 of them. So it was quite common to say, okay, which War Eagle are you really talking about? War Eagle 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Because we're having the War Eagle historian in Prescott in July, and he's going to try and tell us the War Eagle story. So the Enterprise was coming up to here. There was big to-do in Hudson and Stillwater. And so all these people got on, and they were coming upriver. They get above Afton, past Catfish Point, out into the big lake just below here, and the winds came up, and they got out there, and one of their paddle wheels broke. And so they only had power on one side. They couldn't control it. The winds were going to tip it over and this type of thing. Luckily, they had a first mate and some deckhands who knew what they were doing. They put out a sea anchor. And people say, what's a sea anchor? A sea anchor is something you put out that will float out in front, so as the wind blows, the boat sits back here, but it keeps us faced into the wind. Well, I got a sea anchor out. It ended up on the shore down in the lower part of the lake down there. There used to be a little town down there called Glenmont. And as all these people came up, the crisis hits, and the richest guy in Prescott comes up to the captain and says, "You got to save me." And the captain says, "Get out of here." Kicked him out. Well, it drifted in. Luckily, not a person lost their life. They get to shore, and they had to walk to Prescott, walk to Hudson, get wherever they were going to go. And the rich guys there, again, nobody would help them, nobody would talk to them. He had to walk home alone. Good. Because he thought he was better than any of the women or children on the boat simply because he had money. This is the Prescott, built in Prescott, 1870. It was a log boat, It was a ferry boat. It pushed the log rafts. The first log raft ever used a steamboat, of course, had a Prescott pilot at the helm. You know, and it was George Winans, the Winans family. I'm old enough to know his grandsons. And he was a pilot also. And so this is the Prescott, built in Prescott, Wisconsin. This is the St. Croix. This is another one that was built in Prescott. It was a famous boat. This little guy was pretty fast. Steamboats are unusual. You would build two steamboats exactly the same dimensions, same engine, same exact size, and one was faster. And boats are just like that. You can't explain why. It's just the perfect mix makes them work. But this one was one of the fastest boats on the St. Croix. Couldn't beat the Gray Eagle, though. We'll get to that later. City of Hudson, here's your boat. This is being repaired right down in front of us here. Putting new planking in it because they were made out of wood and they got kind of beat up, the snags. A snag is a log that sits like this. So what happens is the trunk, or the roots, have a root ball. So they sit on the bottom and it sits up like this, and they're a perfect angle, so when you hit it with a boat, it pierces the bottom of your boat and down they go. So the myth is that they all blew up and burned. No, far more died from snags. Far more died from snags. And so this guy, you had to replace him. Plus ice, we'll get to ice. Ice is not friendly to steamboats, or any boat actually. Ben Campbell, built in Osceola. This is 128 feet long, built in Osceola, just upriver. Osceola was a famous boat building site, which is, you know, you don't think about that, but it was. This, as Stillwater was, Hudson was. It was a mail line, so they would get the government contract to haul the mail. Anybody remember the railroads? Some of you people are my age or a little older. When they used to come by with the hook and grab the bag with the train as it went by, I used to love that when I was a kid, go watch them, because once in a while they didn't hook it and it would fall on the ground. And then the next train would have to grab it, and that's how they moved the mail. This is the A to B, built in Arcola. Arcola doesn't even exist anymore. I mean, it exists as a geographical site, but the city of Arcola is long gone in the mists of time. As Glenmont is, and Otisville, all these places are gone. But we think of steamboats. This is Warroad, Minnesota, up on the border. Well, you don't think about it, but they had steamboats up there. Absolutely. They weren't just a Mississippi and Ohio River thing. They were river transportation all over the world. This is a snag boat. That's what he does. He goes out and pulls the snags out. This is the Minnesota River. The Minnesota River said, it's the crookedest river you ever saw. The guy who went up it, he said he never saw one single stretch that was a quarter mile long that was ever straight. He said the boat would have to run into the shore, back up, run into the shore, back up, run into the shore to get around the corners. It was so crooked. One of the greatest steamboat adventures in history, George Byron Merrick. To me, I think it is the greatest American steamboat adventure in our history. In 1860, they were sent upriver on the Minnesota 300 miles, so to Fort Waverly, which was on the other side of Mankato. But it was a 19-foot flood stage. And so they would hammer through the trees and just go right across the farmland and cut it. And when they got up there were two boats that went up there. They picked up Sherman's Regiment. Sherman's Regiment was a famous artillery regiment in the Civil War. But every artillery regiment has an auxiliary group of regular soldiers that protect them. They picked up these soldiers, put them on the boats. They had 100 carpenters. You guys fixed all these boats up in a day. They had 100 carpenters, fixed them all back up. Down the river they went. Now remember, you can't stop, so hang on. They crashed through the trees. They get them down there, and they get them to Prairie du Chien. They hopped on a train. They were the first Union soldiers in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the Civil War. And as a pilot, when I read the story, it scares the dickens out of me. Another one, Minnesota River, smaller boats. The steamboat era on the Minnesota River lasted only about 16, 18 years, and then the trains came in and took over. I got this one because that's my son's girlfriend's name. Sternwheeler Anson Northrop, first steamboat on the river. The Red River of the North. Well, the commercial community in St. Paul put out a prize of $2,000, which today would be like $2 million, for the first person to get a steamboat on the Red River. So Anson Northrup has his boat winched up on top of St. Anthony Falls on logs, and he gets up above St. Anthony Falls, he heads up the Mississippi, gets as far as he can go, gets in the Gullwing River, he goes up that, gets in the Croix River, went as far as he could, then he cut his boat into pieces. And they used oxen horse teams to haul his boat to the Red River. They reassembled it, put it back together, and the next spring he launched the Anson Northrup on the Red River of the North, and he won the $2,000 prize. Northrup Auditorium at the University of Minnesota is named after him. Here we are. Now we're in Clearwater, Minnesota. This is the Mississippi above St. Anthony Falls. People don't realize that the logging era was all over. The St. Croix, the Mississippi, all these rivers. But again, this is a snag boat. You see that kind of structure in the front? That's so we can pull things out and move them, and it was probably a government boat. So I was at a meeting, and this guy asked me a trick question. He said, what was the farthest place up the St. Croix River that a steamboat was ever built? And I said, Taylor's Falls or St. Croix Falls. He says, nope, you're wrong. Gordon, Wisconsin. I said, what? They had a famous boat architect who designed Lakers on the Great Lakes. They hired him. He designed a boat called the City of Gordon. It was used to move logs from the Chippewa watershed to the St. Croix watershed. They would push them through the dam at Gordon, and then they would come down to Stillwater because Stillwater needed the logs. So I was wrong. The first steamboat, the farthest up, was the City of Gordon from Gordon, Wisconsin. That's why I like doing this, because I hear stories from people, things I didn't know. And so I called Gordon, Wisconsin, and I did a bunch of research, and it was one of those interesting facts. Colorado River steamboats. You wouldn't think of the Colorado River. They were all over the place. Colorado River, most of the river workers were Mormons. They worked on the Colorado River, they worked on the Gila River, and they moved people around. Now, this is a fancy one. There you go, but it works. It worked. Excursion boat. This is the Rainy River. This is up by International Falls again. Party boat is what it was. Because remember, you didn't have television, didn't have radio, probably didn't have a photograph, didn't have the mind out of the internet. So what did you do? You went out on boats for excursions. Excursions were very, very famous on the St. Croix. Colorado River, St. George, Utah. Well, if you look on the map to find out where St. George, Utah are, you're going, what? They had boats there? One of my friends, he's in Arizona right now, he's just sent me a photo. He found a steamboat, an old dead steamboat in a junkyard in Arizona, so I'll have a photo of that. The Yukon River. You know, we're here north to Alaska and all this kind of stuff, and they got to go over the passes and all this kind of stuff. The majority of the people and supplies to the gold fields of the Yukon came on steamboats. They didn't have to go over the Chilkoot Pass and all this type of thing. And the steamboat era actually lasted until about the 1950s in Alaska, because there's no roads, there's no bridges. So to get anywhere on the Yukon River, the state of Alaska ran ferries into the 1950s on the Yukon River. And so that's another one of those things. What, Yukon River? You don't think of that. Steamboat on the Missouri, using spars. They would call this grasshoppering or crabbing. So you would hit shallow water, and your boat's stuck, and you would have these big things like this, and you would stick them out in front, they're big white pine logs, and then you would use your steam power as a winch, and you would drag yourself over, reach up again, drag yourself over, and it was called grasshoppering. Wow. Well, and I mentioned Abe Lincoln. He actually held a patent for a system to get over sand like this. It was never built, but he owned the patent. So, grasshoppering. Here's my boat. This is the Gray Eagle. Fastest boat ever. Designed by Daniel Smith Harris, who was probably, I want to be him. He was an adventure pilot. He said, if there's heavy dew, I can get a boat there. And so he was a lightning pilot. And he designed this boat to be the fastest boat. This boat and another boat were built in the same shipyard, same plan, same engine. This one was 2 miles an hour faster. Who knows why? He never lost a race. And there were races quite often. And they raced for prestige. And they rest, you can see, you can't see it very well here. He always had a rooster up here because whoever won the race got to keep the flag. He never lost his flag. He never lost his flag. So anyway, this guy was a gray eagle and designed up here. It sank when it hit the Rock Island Bridge. And then he was so bummed out, he left the river and never went back. He moved to Galena, Illinois, and I've been to his house, but not in his house. That's next summer. But the mists of time are strange. The death of the gray eagle is a story that I cannot verify, but it was the fastest boat on the river in the 1860s. And the story goes that he sank his own boat intentionally because he had found out that the Confederates, under Quantrell and a few other names that you would recognize from Civil War history, were going to come and try and steal his boat to run guns for the Confederacy. And they said he sank his own boat intentionally so they couldn't steal the fastest boat on the river. Do I know if it's true? Have no idea, but it's a neat story. And I found it in a couple places. Here's the match race between Robert E. Lee and a natural. Now, this is a match race. That means the boats are carrying the same number of people, the same weights, everything. It's a match race. That's what a match race is. New Orleans to St. Louis, and everybody got along the shore. They advertised it. They had parties. They sold beer, and they had picnics all the way up. And most of the lower Mississippi is willow trees and mud flats because there's no towns along there unless you find a rock knob like at Vicksburg, Memphis, and these type of things. Most of it, the lower Mississippi, I've been up and down it a few times. Nothing compared to up here. Just isn't. And again, I'm biased, but that's what, a lot of mud, a lot of trees. That's about it. Key City, here's your boat. Key City is another of my favorite boats. So this guy was in Hudson, Wisconsin, the pilot. And this other pilot of the Northern Air was out there, and they were, of course, probably imbibing in some spirits. And they said, well, we'll race. So they left here. And they had a match race the next day. The first person to get to Prescott, turn and go up the Mississippi River, won the race. Now, if you're not familiar, there's a couple narrow spots, Catfish Bar, the Kinnickinnick, and these types of things they had to get through. The winning boat was the Key City. Because this guy over here, he's the engineer, he saved two 55-gallon drums of pine pitch. And when he got about a mile above the Prescott Bridge down there, or Prescott, he dumped those pine pitch barrels into the boilers, increased the temperature, and it won by 100 feet. So that was the match race. Well, these people were creative, they were tenacious, they were inventive. They found most of us in here, living back in that era, we would be helpless. What they could do still absolutely amazes me. I mean, we have our stuff, but you had nothing, and they made it work. The Key City also spent time on the Missouri. Now, wooding up, they burn wood. These big boys burn 25 to 40 cords of wood a day. 40 cords of wood would fill this room entirely, floor to ceiling, every day. Now, you think about how many trees died. There were 400 of these big boats burning 25 to 40 cords of wood a day. Basically, we denuded the Mississippi River Valley of trees. And the pirates of the Mississippi, who were they? They were you and me with an axe. We walked down with our axes. We went back where nobody could see us. We cut trees, didn't own them. And we'd pile them on the shore, put a white flag out there. They'd come and buy the wood from us, and then we'd sneak off somewhere else and cut wood. So that was the pirates of the Mississippi. But the land wasn't surveyed at that time. So we really didn't steal it. But that's the pirates. The other pirates were the bankers, but we won't get into that. But anyway, this is a famous painting of wooding up. And they would have to stop sometimes twice a day to get wood. Now, after the Civil War, coal came in, but coal was expensive. So they continued to use wood wherever possible. And then you get to a big snag where there would be all this wood. Well, you would stop and cut all the wood out of the water just so you could burn it. And they would have races. Okay, I'm coming across Lake Pepin going northbound. And you're right behind me, and I see you coming in your boat. Well, I put it into full speed because I want to get to Smith Landing. Smith Landing is a famous landing just north of Diamond Bluff. The Smith family was known as having the best wood. They had this stuff over here. And so if you use pine, it took that much, it took hickory. So many of the races were to see who got to the woodlots first. It was important because you paid the same price. It's just that, can you imagine having to, this is the difference in the caloric content of the wood that the boats used. You know, so we don't think about that. And it also changed the watershed of the Mississippi. By cutting the trees weren't there to hold the water. The mosses died. So because of the steamboats, we accentuated the floods and that on the Mississippi. We didn't know it. There's no guilt in this. It's just we did not know that. I mentioned Galena, the Galena River. Now it used to be 350 to 400 feet wide. It's 80 feet wide now because they cut all the trees off the hillsides. It eroded, went into the river, and it's now a very shallow thing. And they used to have 500 steamboats a year go to Galena. You could barely get a fishing boat there anymore. So I mean, it happens. We didn't know, wasn't intentional. This is St. Paul. And this is the Wabasha or the Robert Street Bridge right there. And this is 1867 St. Paul. And in that year, St. Paul had almost 2,000 steamboat landings. I mean, so now we're into the big time steamboat era. 2,000. This is landing at night in Prescott. You know, you didn't have lights, you didn't have electric lights, so they had these flaming things you stick out there, and they'd be on a big stick, and you would put in pine that would burn bright and quickly to light it up. And in George Byron's book, he talks about looking out his bedroom window and seeing the steamboats landing at night in the flickering lights of these flames. And I've seen a couple of these baskets. I'm trying to find one, but haven't found one yet. This is Prescott. This is, now ladies, look what you're wearing. All these fancy dresses and this type of thing. You know, this is 1876, July 4th, 100th birthday of our nation. Now, aptly, this steamboat is named the Centennial. So in the centennial of our nation, the steamboat Centennial was in Prescott, Wisconsin. During this era at night, there would be over 1,000 people a night staying in Prescott, sleeping in hotels, motels, bar floors, haymows, your floor, anywhere they could, because there were no locks and dams. So above the mouth of the St. Croix, the water was very shallow. This guy needed 5.5 to 6.5 feet of water. Everybody had to get off. Then the dinkies show up. That's this guy. That's the plowboy. He only needs 18 inches of water. And so 30 to 40 of those little guys would show up from St. Paul and Stillwater. You would get back on the little guys the next day and continue your voyage. The last functioning sawmill in Prescott was the Dudley Mill right there. Sawed its last lumber in about 1896, but it didn't saw St. Croix logs because the St. Croix Boom Company, the octopus, had eaten up all the lumber. And not much was coming down the river to Prescott to be bought and sawed up. So the Dudley brothers were quite inventive. They went above St. Anthony Falls in Minneapolis and they bought all the logs that came down the Mississippi River for 5 years in a row, made log rafts on the Mississippi, pushed them to Prescott, and sawed them up in Prescott. This is the last functioning sawmill in Prescott. This is where George Byron Merrick's bedroom was, right here. There's not a brick of any of this left. We have a giant condominium down there now. I love the people who live there, but it was a tremendous mistake by our city. When you give away your riverfront, it's gone forever. That is a tremendous mistake. I've seen all these cities want to do it. Our condominium is used as what not to do on your riverfront, so at least we're good for something. Don't give it away, because you're not going to get it back. This is Prescott. They're loading. This old building was built in 1898, the Independent Order of Oddfellows, which was an anti-drinking thing. But it was an opera house. And the Prescott School District, we played basketball, we had our plays there, we had our graduation. And here is the musser, and there was a loading ramp, and he's loading in Prescott because Prescott became a grain milling site. We had 6 functioning grain mills at the same time and shipped out thousands of barrels of grain and wheat every year. Well, oops. Remember I said they're all made out of wood? They burn coal, they use kerosene for lights, they use candles. What happens? They burn. The roof of most of them had a fine layer of sand about 1 inch deep so that the sparks wouldn't land on the roof of the boats and start your boat on fire. Just one of those things. This is Cincinnati Harbor. 6 boats burned that day. And I don't know how many died exactly, but about 30 or 40 died on this day. And it started by, they had some kerosene barrels on one that leaked. The guy was trying to fix it, and he had a light, lantern. His lantern tipped over, and Katie bar the doors, here we come. This is another photo of the same day. And they cut them loose. See, these were cut loose down here, and just let them drift downriver to get away from the main fire because they thought maybe they could save the vessels then. Oops, there ain't enough water. I'm stuck. This one's done. When you see a boat that is like this, where it has this curvature, that's called hogback. That means you broke its keel. They're going to bust this baby up, scrap it out, take the engine, put it somewhere else. That one is done. Here's another one. If there's people walking alongside of your steamboat, you're probably not in the right place. You're probably not in the right place. But it's kind of a good look at what the stern wheelers looked like. And there were stern wheelers and side wheelers. And they both had properties. The side wheelers were a little bit more maneuverable, but a stern wheeler had more brute power. They didn't use propellers because propellers were in use on craft in about the 1860s, 1870s, but they didn't work up here because of the shallow water and the sandbars and all that kind of stuff. Whereas these guys, you put them at the dead end, they don't go that far down in the water, they could survive. But it's like, oops, another one. This is a gruesome story. All the people, they come to the landing, right? And you all got your relatives there. And so you all go to the same side of the boat to say, wave at everybody, and the boat tipped over. I don't know what to say about that one. I'm glad it wasn't the pilot. This is the Quincy. This is a famous boat. This is just above Diamond Bluff, between Diamond Bluff and Prescott. Quincy was one of those, what you call a wedding cake or a gingerbread boat. It was decked out. It was beautiful. And when you people took a ride on these fancy boats, you were probably treated the best you were treated anywhere in your entire life. And I am not exaggerating. Most of the people didn't have a lot of money. And if you had enough money to be on the upper deck, you had your own room. You had your own, they had water in there, this type of things. You had dining. For me, I'm down on the main deck. I'm living with the pigs and the sheep and whatever else down there and sleeping on whatever I can. And so depending on where you were in the strata, you were either down there or you were down here. So you people who were riding in the second deck, you ate like kings and queens. And boats were known as having the best food. So people would choose their boat because they knew who the cook was. And the boats would compete with each other, raise the wages of the cook to get the best cook to move from boat to boat. And people knew where that cook was and rode the boat specifically because of that cook. You know, and music on the river. They would travel boats because they had famous musicians, and there were people who would ride the boats regularly to hear these famous musicians. So, I mean, what our ancestors did was, to me, was absolutely amazing. Oops, here's the Quincy. A little later. This is at Trempealeau, Wisconsin. Now, you see that they actually raised it, pumped it out, patched it up, but oops, one of those things. Oh. Now, if these guys are down here in the water and you're up here, probably ain't good. And remember this hogback stuff? He's done for too. And this was a government boat. It has the snag boat stuff out there, and that one's gone too. The Arkansas River, we don't think about that, but the Arkansas River, we've heard about the Trail of Tears, where the Native Americans were moved. Well, this was an extension of the Trail of Tears. They would walk, they would get on the steamboats. Sometimes they got on the steamboats in Tennessee River or the Cumberland River, and they were taken out into Oklahoma and dumped on the range out there. So steamboats were a big part of the Trail of Tears. They didn't walk all the way, they didn't ride horses. The steamboats took a lot of them. Stern wheel, the city of St. Joseph. This is another gingerbread boat. You know, and they were works of art. And also, so you, young lady, you're an out-of-work artist, and you need to get to St. Paul. Well, you come onto the captain's boat in St. Louis and say, I tell you what, I'll paint these paintings on the inside of your boat as pay. And so they would pay artists to paint these beautiful paintings on the inside of their boats as their ticket price. And so many of these boats on the inside were basically a floating art museum. Of course, some of them were dreadful. You were good. The Kate Adams, you see a basic design here, side wheelers. This is where the kitchens were. Now, ladies, they'll let you in the pastry kitchen anytime because they were spotless. They made all these fancy things. They didn't let you in the other kitchen where they killed all the chickens and pigs and stuff because that wasn't quite so good. And when you talk about the food, they made all you second deck people all this fancy meal. And before you, the last night you were on the boat, the cook always outdid himself. And the one I was reading about, the last night before you got to St. Paul, you finished your gourmet meal and they served you 13 desserts. Not 13 to choose from. Each one of you got 13 desserts in its own little bowl and dish. Now, anything you people didn't eat, they put in a thing called the grub pile. So they would go back, put it in these tubs, then they would put it down, and then the deckhands would eat from that, the grub pile. Now, hey, everybody's got to eat. And what they didn't eat went to the lower deck passengers who lived with the chickens and pigs, and that's where the food went. You think about garbage disposals on the Mississippi. Didn't have any. What did they do with the garbage? You know, they tossed it. We had a diver in Prescott. He was a rescue diver. He was diving in 1981, and in the bottom in front of Prescott, where the boats used to park, he found glass bottles from 1865, 1881, because the glass is the only thing that's left. So we have a display in our history center of glass bottles that were found in the bottom of the Mississippi. But you don't think about that. What did they do with the garbage? I was working in New Orleans, and I had to carry, all by myself, I had to carry my little bag of garbage about a half a mile and put it down where they'd pick it up. And these guys on the boat, deckhands, they said, well, we'll take care of your garbage for you, Dallas. And I thought, okay. And I was babysitting the boat in New Orleans is all I was doing. And I watched them. I'm sitting in the pile house, and they come in, and they take my little bag of garbage, you know, like this, because it's just me. They got out in the middle of the Mississippi, and what did they do with it? I didn't let them take my garbage out anymore. I walked a half a mile. And that was about 1982. This is the Twin City. This is a famous boat up and down here. This is a log rafter. The log rafters were an unusual boat. Many of them were high power for hauling log rafts. Remember, the largest log raft ever moved, and again, it was a Prescott pilot, 9 million board feet in one log raft. 276 feet wide, 1,900 feet long. So that's 6 football fields plus the end zones. And they're waddling these things down the Mississippi River. J.M. White, this is one of the last of the gingerbread wedding cake boats built. This thing was deluxe. I mean, even got the crenellations around up here. These were made right here. They had a hinge in there, so when you went under short bridges, you could lay your stacks down, get under, and then raise them back up. Well, as I told you, our ancestors were creative and tenacious. The president. Now, this is kind of a mock-up. The president was still around in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and this is not it isn't a photo, it's a drawing, and it is not a great drawing. I actually have photos. I actually know a pilot who worked on the president. But look at this thing. I mean, okay, this is the Red Cloud. This is up on the Mississippi River. And again, up there they were using this as a packet boat. A packet means it's moving people, passengers, supplies, goods. It wasn't a logging boat. This is a packet boat. This is the Delta Queen. And the guy who's driving it, his name is Eugene Popeye Tronier, and where's he from? He's from Prescott. And so this is 1983 in front of Prescott on the Delta Queen. This is Afton, just south of Catfish Bar. This is right in back of Afton, coming up in about 1890s. And we think that this little boat down here was a clam boat. And people say, a clam boat? Clamming was a viable business on the St. Croix for about 2 decades or so, because the clams in the Mississippi River, we had clammed them out. There were hardly any left. Clams were used to make buttons. They made 3 billion buttons from clamshells. I wonder why there were no clamshells left. And we take over with plastic. And so the Atchison family was down there. They were in the clamming business. The clam were running out. They moved to Prescott. They commercial fished and clammed. And so I knew a guy who, when he was little, he clammed on the St. Croix. And me, we would just go out with our mask and flippers and find them. And we'd pile them inside of a rock thing till we had 100. And we'd throw them back out in the water, wait a couple weeks, and we'd go get them again. I didn't want to eat one. I didn't want to. This is what they look like on the inside. So you had a door to the outside in your room, and you had a door to the inside, which took you right into the grand salon. And these things were exquisite. Here's another one. Here's what your rooms look like. You know, you got your towels, you got a water basin and that type of thing. I don't think it's quite like a Viking cruise line now, but for 1860s and 70s, pretty nice. Here's the steering wheel. Now understand, at this time they didn't have hydraulics that we have now. So everything had to be done with ropes and pulleys. So you had to have this great big honker of a wheel, and when in high winds, you'd have 2 or 3 men hanging onto that wheel trying to control the boat. Now they just use a little stick like my arm, and you move it, and the hydraulics take care of it all. But this is what a pilot house looked like. And here's how he contacted the engineers. He'd holler down there, blow the whistle. On the boat I was on, anytime a pilot wanted to, he revved the engines. If you revved it twice, that means get here in a hurry. If you revved it 3 times, that means something's wrong. This is Prescott. Now this is a lumber raft. What's the difference between a log raft and a lumber raft? A log raft are raw logs, not touched. They're round and they float down the river. This is a lumber raft coming down from either here or Stillwater. They were sawed into shingles, 2x4s, 2x8s, 2x6s, hooked into these bundles, and then shipped downriver. That is a lumber raft. This is Prescott Bay right out in front of Prescott. And you see this is all shingles riding on the top. Okay, this is the C.W. Cowles being piloted by George Winans, Prescott guy. You guys are out on the party boat. This is the North Star. He's getting the logs ready to go. We can look in here. These guys are called river pigs, and it was not a derogatory term. They called themselves river pigs. That's what these guys who worked on the log rafts and the lumber rafts called themselves, river pigs. Oops. Where was the largest log raft? Right behind us. Over 3.5 to 4 miles. It was 7 feet deep, and it almost ended Stillwater because no logs came to Stillwater for 3.5 months. There's no logs to saw. There's no money to be made. There's nothing to sell. The mills were going broke. The towns were going broke. The people were going broke. But us, we came up on a steamboat from Prescott. We drank beer and came up and watched them. That was a big excursion to go up and look at the log jam. And they would come all the way from St. Paul around through Prescott and up here to look at the log jam. They tried, we tried with moving it with pike poles and cant hooks. We tried dynamite. They put cables across the St. Croix and tried to lift them out. But a little over 3 months later, they finally got that fixed. And they just changed the system after that to avoid it. But if you get just below the Taylor's Fall Bridge, you'll see a place called the Angle, where the river goes like this, rock walls, that's where they always started. That's where they always started. Okay, here you are, Davenport, lumber raft. Now this is a bow boat out there. So there's a pilot out here, and this guy has a semaphore system of flags that he would use to say forward, back, full ahead, full reverse, and as you waddle these things down. You didn't push very hard, because if you pushed too hard, you'd break the lumber rafts up. And then if you got to Lake Pepin in a high wind, you stopped. Lake Pepin was the graveyard of lumber rafts. The shores of Lake Pepin would be littered with basically millions of board feet of lumber. So all the people around Lake Pepin liked it because they got free wood. Well, sometimes from bad things come good things. This is below Prescott. These are things called wing dams, and most of you have heard of them. Wing dam is to keep the river out in this channel. Okay, the wing dams were put in the 1870s as a government improvement, because they found out we have to have them. These same wing dams are still out there today in Prescott. If you go to Freedom Park, you can get up on top and you can see where they were. Now this is before the locks and dams, so this is low water time. The Red Wing Dam didn't close until 1938. That's when you ended up with the river you see here. Because before 1938, most of us could walk across the St. Croix here and not get wet above our belt line. Okay, this is a snag boat on the Ohio. This is the famous one. This is another, these are Corps of Engineers, it's a dredge. So we started dredging our waterways because we found out we need to move it. We need to move things. Here we are, now we're up in Canada. We don't think about it. They had it in Canada too. C.A. Woodruff. This is one of the most famous snag boats run by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Corps of Engineers' 250th birthday this year, by the way. St. Louis. 26 boats burned this day. It burned the entire St. Louis riverfront. 2 blocks back from the river, every building was torched. So you talk about fires, right here. This was the worst. And the problem was you had one stupid pilot. After this adventure, he didn't die, but he was never allowed on a boat again because the other pilots never. What happened was he came out of the Missouri River just above St. Louis. His boat was on fire. Now, by the rules of the river is if your boat's on fire, you run it into the shore. He didn't do that. He comes back down into St. Louis on a boat, and the boats were just like this next to each other, and he came down and ran into them with his burning vessel, burned 26 of them. He also did some other stupid stuff. We won't get into that, it's a different topic. Stockton, California, you don't think about it, the Sacramento River. How did they move all of the fruits and vegetables and produce of the Imperial Valley? Steamboats. Steamboats. Again, we don't think of that because we're here. We see the Mississippi, we see the St. Croix. This is one that I had an adventure. This is the Yovari. The Yovari was bought. So the president of Peru made all this money selling bird poop. Guano is fertilizer. They still do it today. And so he was a very wealthy country, and he wanted to have a military presence on Lake Titicaca, which is the highest navigable lake in the world. So he buys a military vessel from England. They built it in England in 1862. They put it together with nuts and bolts. They didn't rivet it or weld it. Then they had to put it into 2,736 packages that could weigh no more than 350 pounds, because that's all a mule could carry. So they did that. They come around to South America, Tierra del Fuego. They get up to the coast of Chile, which at that time was owned by Peru. They unloaded. They made it about 50 miles, and the company went broke. So all 2,000 packages sat there for about a year. Then another company took it over, and it took them 8 years to move all the packages to Lake Titicaca, because Lake Titicaca is 12,000 feet in altitude. By mules, by hand. And guys, what did we do? We carried the masts. The masts were 65 to 75 feet long, and it took 50 to 70 men to carry them up 12,000 feet. So that's what we did for a few months. We carried the mast. And they got it up there. They got it together, launched it in 1872. I spent an hour and a half with a Lake Titicaca historian telling me the story of this boat. And Alcides, and so here's where they came. Here's their first one. They got here, and it sat here. Then they got it all the way to Lake Titicaca, finally. What was strange was no weapons ever showed up. No cannons ever showed up. No machine guns ever showed up. Somebody just forgot that it was a military. Now, it was used by the military to move troops a couple times, but basically it was a ferry boat and a mail boat on Lake Titicaca. And I just spent 2.5 weeks down there last fall. And so this is the kind of people I look for. Alcides was wonderful. So here's what it looks like now. It's a bed and breakfast. You can stay overnight in it. And here's Alcides, is a poor one, but there's Lake Titicaca. This is the guy, he's 78 years old, been guiding for over 60 years. Boy, is he a treasure. And here's another one. This is, but by this time they had a train, so they could get it up there in a train instead of us carrying it. And now they're redoing this one right now to make it a floating hotel. Oops, we're in the Amazon. This one got stuck and died. The Amazon River was another famous steamboat river, and this boat went down in the early 1900s, and this is all that is left of it. And this is where that boat was. And this is you think about it, this is the Amazon River. You're 2,600 miles from the ocean. And again, remember, for the heavy dew, they can get there. Remember I said ice? This is Frontenac, Minnesota. They're cutting ice to use to sell. Ice right out here was a major product. The St. Croix River was a premium ice river, if not the premium ice river of the nation. We would ship out thousands of tons of ice a winter by steamboats, by rail, and the story is old Babe, who died at 97, and I knew him as a kid, his family ran the ice business. They were delivering ice to Hastings, Minnesota, and the people in Hastings said, well, you're charging too much. So he just quit delivering. So they had to use ice out of the Mississippi. Well, when they got tired of looking at their bottom of a bottle of water, the glass of water would have a quarter of an inch of mud on the bottom. 2 weeks later, they were back to Babe paying his price. Competition, right? Oops. Now, remember, if you're walking by your boat, if they're out on the ice with skates on, you're probably someplace you shouldn't be. You know, just probably should not be there. This is that Quincy again. They did get it up. Now look at this. Cincinnati, Ohio. This is called an ice gorge. There's no locks and dams. So when it warmed up quickly and the water popped up, the ice broke up and it came down and wiped everything out. I mean, it would go down the river at high speed and it would chew the steamboats up. Literally chew them up. This is Lake Pepin now. Personally, I was stuck out in Lake Pepin in the ice. First boats up in the spring, we were stuck there for 40 hours in the ice and winds and couldn't get across. So it is still the determiner of how to get up here. I see the Corps of Engineers out doing ice cores on Lake Pepin to figure out when they could get a towboat up this year. Oops, another disaster. Here you are again, the ice gorges. And actually, you think, a boat can go through this much ice, no problem. And it could. The problem, every time you broke the ice, it made a brand new razor blade. And it ate into your wooden hull. Well, as you went through, it kept whittling at your hull, and that's why the boats would sink, because the ice would cut through 6 inches of white oak, and down they would go. One of my favorite boats, the Fannie Harris, died right at Prescott for that reason. The ice ate through the hull. Sea Wing. This is the big disaster on Lake Pepin. 90-some people died in 1890. The boat tipped over in a windstorm. The pilot made a mistake. He was found negligent, lost his license. He was never punished because his own wife and son died in the accident. I've been to the graveyards and all this kind of stuff. There's a great book put out by the Goodhue County Historical Society on the Sea Wing. It's 2nd edition. A great story. It really is. And I also host guided bus tours down Lake Pepin, so there's a lot more to the Sea Wing. But the bottom line is the people in Diamond Bluff wanted to lynch him, so he moved to Prescott. And here he is. This is the day of the accident. The boat's only supposed to have 100 people. This is the Jim Grant, they had over 250. And the pilot they went to Lake City for a music event. They were going to come back to Red Wing. He didn't want to leave, but all you people had to get home. Well, he comes out around the point, couldn't see, and the wind hit him, and he was done. Over it went. Captain David Wetherns. His son became a river pilot and actually piloted with some of my old friends on the river up into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So we're a river rat town. Here you are, the Sultana, the greatest maritime disaster in American history. Everybody thinks, oh, the ocean liners and all this stuff. Nope, Sultana. Those men are Union soldiers who had just come out of the Confederate prison camps, which were some of the most gruesome prison camps ever in history. They got to Memphis. There were 3 or 4 boats. They had a military guy that said, well, this is going to cost too much. Can you put them all on one boat? So rather than spend a few extra dollars, they put over 2,000 people on this boat, overloaded it. They got 5 or 6 miles above Memphis. 3 of the 4 high-pressure boilers blew up at the same time. 1,164 people died. And so, oops, this is Prescott, party barge. You're taking your picnic baskets and bringing what you want to drink. Now you see here they have lights. The lights actually came in about the late 1880s where you can have a spotlight at night. Otherwise, these guys who are pilots, they could tell the difference between water black, tree black, and sky black. That's how good they were. And if I'm up there at night and my night vision is there, and one of my deckhands walks out there and lights a cigarette in front of me, they've just destroyed my light vision. Most of the time they took that deckhand and threw him in the river. Oh well, when you do dumb things, bad things happen, right? It's like when I'm your first mate, the first time you walk onto a barge without a life jacket is the last time you ever walk on a barge without a life jacket because they fire you. I'm not going to let you risk your life because you're stupid. Because I know people who died because they went out there at night with no life jacket. Fell in, nobody's with them, they're dead. Another Prescott excursion. How did circuses move? This is how they moved, on boats. They moved on boats. They had these giant, this is a mock-up. We actually have some photos of a real one. This sat 1,200 people, and it moved around with a floating opera house. They had circuses with lions and tigers and bears, oh my, and all the rest of the stuff. Rhinoceroses. They had a rhino that fell in the river. They found him 3 days later. He had gotten out in some island down there. So they rescued the rhino. Dan Rice, Uncle Sam was modeled after Mr. Rice. He was the consummate showman. He always dressed in red, white, and blue with a top hat. And so at the time, he was the best paid person in the United States. And the Civil War started, but he didn't side with the South. He didn't side with the North. So he was kind of not liked by anybody. What he did was he spent his money helping the Confederate soldiers' wives and children, and he spent his money helping the Union soldiers' wives and children. When the war was over, he went back in business. But during the war, all he would do was donate his money to help the people who needed it. He would not participate in the war. Nancy.
Can we leave a little bit of time here to questions?
Let me get to a couple things. I want to go quickly because I got some stuff that relates to you. That circuses, Prescott, St. Elmo, showboats. What's this? This is your Hudson Bridge, built in 1913, torn down in 1951. This is where your causeway out there comes out here and into Minnesota. So I wanted to show you, if you hadn't seen this is your bridge. And there's another. And it had to be that high because the rules of navigation are there has to be 55 feet of clearance between normal pool and the bridge so that navigation and traffic can get under it. The Arcola Bridge, just above, this is under construction. Here's what it looks like now. Stunning bridge. I used to build bridges, so I think they're cool. Now this is unusual. These maps came in about 3 months ago. They were done in 1932. They are navigation maps of the St. Croix River from Stillwater north. And you'll see the name of towns that don't exist anymore. You'll see springs, you'll see a buoy, you'll see a light. And this is how many miles above the Stillwater Bridge you are. There's Browns Valley, all this type of thing. These just came in within the last 3 months. And the first weekend in May, we're starting our big show in Prescott of steamboats, towboats, and river history, and you will see 20 times what you've seen here today. And we're actually having river historians come for the summer. We'll have a speaker series. It won't be me. Well, in August it'll be me, but you'll see some other people. So to me, these are fascinating. That Sioux Line Bridge, here it is. Arcola existed then, doesn't anymore. We now have these matted and framed and they'll be on display. Marine, Minnesota, the first sawmill in the upper Midwest. But I wanted to see these because Otisville, I see it in history, but it doesn't exist anymore. So I'm going to stop yakking and you're going to ask me questions. Yes, ma'am.
Are any of those fancy steamboats still around that you can see any?
There are no real ones. The last real one ended up being a museum in St. Louis. But most of them are steel hulls. Now, many of the steamboats had steel hulls after the 1870s, but they were expensive, but not any of the real ones. The last real one was in St. Louis, and I think that went about 20 years ago. So you're going to see a model, but you're not going to see the real boat. Yes, sir.
Where did the steamboats land in Hudson before the dams came in?
I wish we'd had these blue maps below us, because they actually landed anywhere and everywhere. They'd have that big gangplank, and sometimes, I'm betting in Hudson and Stillwater, you'd have 8 or 9 or 10 boats stop in a single day. And so the whole riverfront, boom, they put a plank here, and they said that during the steamboat era, you could walk from one end of St. Louis to the other, boat to boat, and go 2 miles and never set foot on shore. There'd be so many steamboats. So, I mean, Prescott, in a week, would have 20 to 50 steamboats go by, and over half of them would stop. And over half of them were coming right here, or to Stillwater. So yeah, because they didn't have all the fancy stuff we have now. They just put a gangplank out, and you guys had to walk with your dresses and that kind of stuff over a little gangplank like this. And then you guys got to carry wood up that same gangplank. So they didn't have as much fancy stuff. Anybody else? Yes.
Was there any idea of conservation, like when they're taking down all the trees?
No, there wasn't, because at that time, when Beltrami came up on Virginia in 1823, he said, "This is an unlimited wealth of wilderness that shall enrich the nation forever," because there were billions and billions of trees. Nobody ever thought they would be exhausted. The same thing as the carrier pigeon. The last one died, and there were literally billions of them, but the last one died in the early 1900s in Wisconsin. So I mean, we always have this thing that it lasts forever. It doesn't. You have to take care of it. You have to take care. But when you're there 100 and some years ago, you're surrounded by wilderness. You don't think that way. You think, geez, I can cut trees and sell them. The conservation era really didn't come into this part until the Isaac Walton League in the 1920s. That's when conservation in this area really stepped in, because they found out that Minneapolis and St. Paul were releasing 65 million gallons of raw sewage into the Mississippi River every day, floating down to Prescott. Well, I'm watching the mental images being drawn in your heads right now, and it ain't too pretty. You ever heard of poop foam? It's a real thing. Anybody else?
I have a question. I know that you have a lot of different sized boats and everything. Is there an average, what load size of boat you had? How many miles that would take you on the river for?
Well, they would average, to come from St. Louis to St. Paul usually was about a week. About a week. Somewhere, 6 days a fast boat, maybe 9 days for a slow boat. So you figure you're going to go 100 miles a day or so, because you had to stop for wood a couple times. And then you had to stop at Bob's house, and then you stopped at a town, and they would actually stop at the farms along the way and deliver things right to their back door. So Amazon had nothing on these people. Yes, ma'am.
On the lumber rafts,
Mhm.
did they have any kind of security? I mean, those were finished goods, more or less, before they were sold. Was there ever any security on there, or was it just the guys that were pushing the rafts?
Usually there was some security in some places where they were moored, yes. Because I happen to know a gentleman from Prescott, he built his house from lumber that somehow ended up at his house. And the lumber rafts at that time were parked out in the bay. So at night he'd go out and scavenge a little. Or they'd stop up at the Stone House. The Stone House is just below the Kinney Connect. That's one of those things I mentioned that we don't know the history. The local historian, who was 94, goes back to 1803 as our first reference, and it was a French trading post at that time. Part of the building is still there, but it was a bunch of things over the years. It was a trading post, it was a bar, the rafts would stop there, all the guys would come up, and you guys just got paid, so you didn't want to go into a bar with all your savings on you. So the story is they hid their money and dug holes and buried the money, so they wouldn't go into the bar and get bumped off and lose it. Well, for years, people were digging holes around that place and never found any. But was it true? Don't know. But again, it's a good story. My father actually lived in that house when he moved here in 1925. Yes?
Did all the boats have to be made of wood?
Pretty much. Remember I said about 1807 they started with some steel hulls, But since there was so much wood and it was expensive, they continued to make wooden hulled boats right up until into the 1900s. Because it was a cost factor. It was a cost factor. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Are steamboats still made of wood?
There's a few. There are a few special ones, and they made them intentionally out of wood just to show how it was done. And it was quite an art. It was quite an art to make them. Very few, though. Most of them are, almost all are steel hulls nowadays. Mm-hmm.
Is the St. Croix, it's still considered a river of commerce? Is
No.
that,
They have to keep the bridges navigable by law. Oh, and by the law that keeps the bridges navigable, that Lincoln guy, he's the one who put that law into effect. Because even though he defended the railroads putting in the bridge, he defended the river by saying, well, if you're going to put a bridge there, you got to be able to open it or it's got to be 55 feet high. So in Prescott, they still have to be able to come through our bridges. They still have to go through your railroad bridge out here. Now, above Stillwater now, I don't know what designation that has taken, but basically the laws are still in effect that they put in 1852, 1856. Because, and a lot goes into it. The lock and dam system are there for three reasons. Recreation, about 15 billion a year is generated, flood control, and transportation. Because all you guys, there's four of you guys, you own the railroads, you got together over martinis and you raised the rates. Well, and the farmers couldn't make any money. They were paying it for freight. So what they did was they started the Grange movement. The basis of the Grange movement was to build the locks and dams so you had competition with the railroads. And so that's how our locks and dams on the upper Mississippi were three reasons. But the main one was that within, I forget how many years, there were 45,000 farmers who were members of the Grange movement screaming at Congress to build some locks and dams so we have competition. Yes, sir.
history of the two islands out here, you know, Beer Can Island?
Yep.
Was that from the dredging of the main channel?
Absolutely, absolutely. This dredge spoil. Because when I worked on the Sioux, they were up doing some dredging in there in the fall of 1978. They were up dredging for about 2 weeks to keep that cut open to the Allen S. King plant, and they just took the sand and pumped it up on the shore there. Prescott Island is basically built the same way. Yep, dredge spoil. Have to have some place to put it.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Who was the pilot and his family who traversed through the Madrid earthquake? What was their name?
Which one's now?
What was the pilot's name who went through the Madrid earthquake?
Well, there were several of them. The ones you're going to see that were famous were the Smith family. There were 5 pilots. Blakely's, Joseph Throckmorton, and I could, Stephen B. Hanks, who lived in Prescott, the Winan family. So, like I said, and the pilots, I don't know if I agree with this, but the pilots, they say, were responsible for the expansion of the United States Midwest. They were adventurous people, they were businessmen, they started businesses. Many of you, if you follow their life, they ran businesses, they owned boats, they did all kinds of things. So they were your risk takers. They were your risk takers. Yes, sir.
Again, the big raft in Stillwater, most of that lumber came from quite a ways away.
Yep.
And skidded in by mules, sleds in the winter, I guess, and then they just accumulated it until they wanted to move it, or what was the philosophy?
At the peak of the logging era, there were 220 logging camps in the St. Croix watershed, at the peak. And at the peak, they would do 175 to 200 million board feet a year. They would cut it in the winter when the ground is frozen, use oxen and horse teams to move it, sit it on the banks, and you build splash dams. At one time, there were 250 to 300 dams in the St. Croix watershed, and most of them were a splash dam, made to be destroyed, made out of rocks and wood and mud. And so I would raise this pool, I would stack my logs here, wait for springtime, then I would tell everybody around, hey, we're going to blow the dam. They'd come out with their beer and picnics, and they would take dynamite, blow the dams, and they would flush the logs downriver. Basically like a modern toilet system. Except the problem was that sometimes too many of them went at once, and you ended up with the big log jam. So after that, they started the Nevers Dam, which is above St. Croix Falls, about 5 miles, and they controlled them there, and they would only allow so many through. But and then the Peanut Line, which ran from Hastings to Stillwater, and there was another rail that went from here to Duluth. They were put in 1876 and 1878. They carried finished lumber too, but still the majority went by log rafts. And the Great Steamboat War of Stillwater, they're building your railroad bridge right out here, and the steamboat guys didn't like that. So they hooked 4 steamboats together, tied them together, and they came down there and started tearing all the pilings out that they had put in to build the bridge. So they had a little set-to there. And, well, but what happened was, it ended up with wider bridges so they could get wider log rafts through it, so that they could have a minimum width. Otherwise, they'd had to whittle these log rafts down to only 80 feet. Now, remember, I told you the biggest ones were 270 to 290 feet tall. In Prescott, too, we used to build the log rafts in Prescott Bay. When the railroad bridge went in 1886, we could only make them 120 feet wide. Then they would assemble the monsters down below Prescott. But they still, that limit. Yes, ma'am?
I think we're going to have to wind it up here.
All right. Well, folks, I've enjoyed the day. Thanks for your questions. But this summer, check for us on Facebook. We'll be open every Saturday and Sunday, and we'll have steamboats and towboats and river history you've never seen. Be well and do good things.